You keep repeating the question like it's something simple, something you can solve by thinking harder or watching another explanation. But the real issue is not the answer, it is the assumption hidden inside the question itself. When you ask whether the universe came from absolute nothing, you are already building a mental picture of nothing that does not actually exist in any meaningful sense. And that is where your thinking starts to collapse without you even noticing it. You imagine nothing as a perfect void. No space, no time, no energy, no laws, no possibility. A complete absence of everything. But here is the uncomfortable truth your mind resists. That kind of nothing is not something you have ever observed, experienced, or proven to exist. It is an idea built from imagination, not reality. And yet you treat it like a real starting point for the universe. That is where your confusion begins. Your mind wants clean answers because clean answers feel safe. If everything had a clear beginning, a clear cause, and a clear structure, then reality would feel controllable. But the deeper you look into the nature of existence, the more that illusion breaks. You are not dealing with a neat system that fits inside human logic. You are dealing with something that ignores your need for simplicity entirely. This is where most people stop thinking deeply. They assume the universe must behave like everyday life, just bigger. But that assumption is weak. It fails the moment you push beyond surface-level thinking. At small scales, the world does not behave like solid certainty. It behaves like probability, fluctuation, and unpredictability. And if that is true at the foundation, then your idea of nothing becomes even more questionable. You are trying to force a familiar structure onto something that was never required to follow it. That is like demanding that silence must be made of sound, just invisible. It sounds logical at first, until you realize it makes no sense at all. And yet your mind keeps doing this, forcing familiar rules onto unfamiliar reality. Here is the first uncomfortable realization you need to accept. Your definition of nothing is not neutral. It is not scientific. It is emotional. It is shaped by imagination, not observation. And because of that, every conclusion you build on it becomes unstable from the start. The shift you need is not more information. It is a correction in how you define the starting point of your thinking. Stop treating nothing as a real physical condition you understand. Start recognizing it as a concept your mind struggles to define without contradiction. Because the moment you stop assuming your version of nothing is real, you begin to see the problem clearly. And that clarity is uncomfortable because it removes the illusion that the universe was ever obligated to fit inside your expectations. You move through life believing empty means empty, as if absence is simple and complete. No matter how advanced your thinking becomes, you still carry that childhood intuition, that when something is nothing, it should be completely inactive, completely dead, completely erased. But that assumption is not just incorrect, it quietly distorts your entire understanding of reality. Because what you call emptiness is not what reality behaves like at its most fundamental level. The truth is, even what you call empty space is not truly empty. It is structured, active, and governed by laws that do not shut off just because nothing visible is happening. You imagine silence as the absence of anything happening, but beneath that silence there can still be constant, invisible activity. And this is where your intuition starts to fail you. You expect stillness, but the deeper layer of reality never actually becomes still. This is not something you fix by simply learning more facts. It is a deeper correction in how you interpret existence itself. You are trained to think in objects, things you can see, touch, measure. So when those objects disappear, your mind labels the remaining space as nothing. But that label is misleading. It gives you the illusion that absence equals non-existence, when in reality, absence can still contain structure, potential, and activity you cannot directly observe. Here is the uncomfortable truth you avoid. Your senses are not designed to reveal the full structure of reality. They are designed to keep you functional in a narrow range of experience. So when you extend your intuition beyond that range, it breaks. You assume stillness means non-action. You assume emptiness means non-existence. But at deeper levels, those assumptions fail completely. And this is where most people unconsciously stop questioning. They accept the surface definition of emptiness because it is easy to understand. But ease of understanding does not equal truth. In fact, the deeper you go into physical reality, the more counterintuitive it becomes. What appears inactive is often governed by hidden activity. What appears empty can still contain fields, fluctuations, and underlying dynamics that never switch off. You are not living in a world where things simply disappear into nothing. You are living in a world where nothing still has rules, still has structure, still has behavior, and that alone should force you to reconsider how confidently you use the word empty. The mindset shift here is simple but uncomfortable. Stop treating emptiness as a complete absence. Start recognizing it as a different kind of presence, one you do not yet fully perceive. Because once you accept that even nothing is not truly nothing, your entire framework for understanding beginnings, endings, and existence itself starts to shift in a way you cannot unsee. You keep searching for certainty as if reality is obligated to give it to you. As if somewhere beneath all complexity there must be a clean, stable foundation where everything finally makes sense in a way your mind can relax into. But that expectation is exactly what keeps you stuck. Because the deeper you look into existence, the less it behaves like a system built on certainty, and the more it behaves like a system built on probability. This is not a minor detail. It changes everything you think you know about reality. You are used to a world where objects seem solid, where causes produce predictable effects, where outcomes feel controlled enough to be understood. But that is only the surface layer, the level your daily experience is tuned to survive in. Beneath that layer, the structure of reality does not follow the same rules of certainty you depend on in everyday thinking. At the foundation, things do not exist in fixed states the way your intuition assumes. They exist in ranges of possibility, shifting between potential outcomes until interaction forces a result to appear. That means what you call reality is not a collection of solid facts sitting still in space. It is a constantly updating system where outcomes are not guaranteed until they happen. And even then, what you observe is only one expression of deeper uncertainty. This is where your comfort breaks down. Because you want the universe to behave like a predictable machine, but it does not. It behaves like a field of probabilities that only becomes definite when observed or interacted with. And that should make you question how much of your confidence in how things work is actually based on reality and how much is based on psychological preference for stability. Here is the harsh realization most people avoid. Certainty is not a property of the universe. It is a property of your limited interaction with it. You experience stability not because reality is stable, but because your perception averages out the instability into something usable. You are not seeing the full system. You are seeing a filtered version that your brain can process without overload. And that filtering process creates a dangerous illusion. It makes you believe that if you just dig deep enough, you will eventually reach a final layer of absolute truth, where everything becomes fixed and predictable. But the deeper understanding reveals the opposite. The further you go, the more probability replaces certainty, and the more reality refuses to settle into a single permanent state. The shift you are being forced toward is uncomfortable but necessary. Stop expecting the universe to behave like a closed book with final answers written inside it. Start accepting that at its core, reality may not offer finality at all, only patterns of likelihood that constantly reshape what you think is real. Because once you accept that instability is not an exception but a foundation, your entire relationship with certainty begins to change. And that change is not gentle. It removes the illusion that you were ever meant to have complete control over understanding existence in the first place. You keep thinking creation must look like a single event, a dramatic moment where everything suddenly appears out of complete absence. That mental image feels satisfying because it gives your mind a clear starting point, a clean before and after, something you can picture, something you can explain, something that fits neatly into human storytelling. But that need for a clean beginning is exactly what blinds you to a deeper and more uncomfortable possibility. What if nothing was never a stable state to begin with? What if it was never a blank canvas waiting for something to appear? The deeper idea is far more unsettling. What you call emptiness may not be empty in the way your mind imagines. It may be a structure that never fully settles, a condition where activity is not an exception but a permanent feature. In that case, creation is not a sudden break from nothing. It is a natural expression of something that was already active in ways you cannot directly perceive. This challenges one of your strongest mental habits, the belief that every effect must have a visible linear cause. You want a clear chain of events, like dominoes falling in order. But reality does not always behave like a straight line. At deeper levels, processes can emerge without a single identifiable starting trigger, not because logic is broken, but because your idea of start is too simplistic for the system you are trying to understand. Here is a difficult truth. Your mind is biased toward beginnings because beginnings make narratives possible. Without a starting point, your thinking feels incomplete. But reality is not required to satisfy your need for narrative structure. It does not organize itself for your convenience. And when you insist that everything must begin from a single moment of absolute nothingness, you are not describing reality. You are imposing a storytelling constraint onto something far more complex. The deeper framework suggests something far more continuous. Instead of a universe that begins, you may be looking at a system where change is always possible, where fluctuations are not rare accidents but built-in features of the underlying structure. In that kind of system, creation is not a one-time miracle. It is an ongoing expression of possibility turning into form. And this is where the discomfort grows. Because if creation is continuous rather than sudden, then the idea of a final origin point starts to dissolve. There is no perfect starting line you can point to and say, everything began here. Instead, you are left with a reality that does not respect the boundaries your mind tries to impose on it. A mindset shift here is unavoidable if you want deeper clarity. Stop demanding a single moment where existence begins from absolute emptiness. Start considering that existence may not require that kind of starting condition at all. Because once you let go of the need for a clean origin, you begin to see a far more complex and continuous picture of reality, one that does not pause just so your understanding can catch up. You keep treating your own thinking style as if it is neutral, as if the way your mind naturally organizes ideas must reflect the structure of reality itself. But that assumption is exactly what traps you. You are not observing reality directly. You are interpreting it through a mental system built for survival, not for absolute truth. And that system has limitations you rarely question. Your mind prefers objects, boundaries, labels, and clear distinctions. It likes to separate things into categories, something or nothing, existence or non-existence, cause or effect. That structure feels stable, but it is not necessarily accurate at deeper levels of reality. It is a simplification your brain uses to make sense of overwhelming complexity. The problem is that you mistake that simplification for the actual structure of the universe. This is where your thinking starts to mislead you without you realizing it. You assume that because a concept feels intuitive, it must be fundamentally correct. But intuition is not designed for deep physics or the nature of existence. It is designed for quick decisions in limited environments. That is why you can confidently navigate everyday life while still holding completely distorted ideas about the deeper nature of reality. Here is a harsh realization you need to face. Your brain is not built to understand reality at its deepest level. It is built to model a useful version of reality. And those two things are not the same. You live inside a simplified interface, not the underlying system itself. So when you try to push your intuition into questions about the origin of everything, you are using a tool that was never designed for that scale of thinking. This is why the idea of nothing becomes so misleading. Your mind turns it into a clean absence because that is the simplest representation it can generate. But simplicity does not equal truth. It only equals efficiency. And efficiency in thinking often comes at the cost of accuracy. You are trading depth for clarity without even realizing it. The deeper issue is that you rely on mental comfort as a guide for truth. If something feels too strange or too abstract, you unconsciously push it away. You return to familiar ideas because they feel safer. But reality does not respect your comfort threshold. It does not simplify itself just because your mind struggles to process it. This creates a constant gap between how you think reality should behave and how it actually behaves. And that gap is where confusion lives. You keep trying to force a clean, logical structure onto something that may not operate in a clean, linear way at all. The shift you need is not to think harder in the same way, but to recognize the limits of the thinking style you currently trust. Stop assuming your intuitive models are reliable at extreme scales. Start treating them as rough approximations, not final answers. Because once you stop confusing mental convenience with truth, you begin to see why your most basic assumptions about nothing, beginning, and existence may never have been as solid as you believed. You keep imagining existence as something that needs a starting push, as if reality is a machine that had to be switched on at some exact moment. That expectation feels natural because everything in your daily life has beginnings and causes you can trace. But the deeper structure of reality does not necessarily follow that familiar pattern. What if the idea of a single starting point is not a law of nature, but a limitation of how you interpret change? At the deepest level, what you call creation may not be an event at all. It may be a process that never stops. Not something that happened once, but something that is always capable of happening. This means existence does not depend on a one-time transition from nothing to something. Instead, it could be based on continuous shifts where different states emerge from underlying possibilities that never fully disappear. This idea forces you to confront something uncomfortable. Your need for a beginning might be artificial. It gives structure to your thinking, but it may not reflect how reality actually operates. You are used to stories that start, develop, and end. Your mind organizes everything in sequences because sequences are easy to understand. But existence itself may not be organized for your understanding. It may simply be. Here's the difficult truth. You may be overestimating the importance of origin itself. You treat the beginning of everything as if it must be a special, singular moment that explains everything that follows. But that assumption comes from human narrative thinking, not from necessity. In a system governed by continuous change, there is no requirement for a final starting point. There can be transformation without origin in the way you imagine it. This is where your intuition struggles. You want a clear line. Before this, nothing. After this, everything. But deeper understanding suggests that such a line may not exist in any meaningful way. Instead, what you call the universe beginning could simply be one expression of ongoing dynamics that do not rely on absolute emptiness as a prerequisite. You also assume that nothing must come before something. But that assumption itself is a rule your mind created, not something proven about reality. If the underlying structure of existence allows for constant fluctuations, then something does not need to emerge from nothing in a single step. It can emerge from a field of possibilities that never fully settles into non-existence. This changes the way you think about beginnings entirely. Instead of asking when everything started, the deeper question becomes whether starting is even the correct framework. Because if reality is fundamentally dynamic, then beginnings are just local perspectives inside a larger continuous process. The mindset shift here is subtle but powerful. Stop demanding a single origin point as the explanation for existence. Start considering that change itself might be more fundamental than beginnings. And once you accept that possibility, the idea of the universe needing to come from absolute nothing starts to lose its grip on your thinking. You keep assuming your confusion means something is wrong with reality, when in fact it may simply mean reality is not designed to match your mental shortcuts. That discomfort you feel when ideas get too abstract is not a signal to stop thinking. It is a signal that your usual framework is breaking down under pressure. And instead of confronting that breakdown honestly, most people retreat back into simplified explanations that feel safer. You are trained to believe that understanding should feel stable and linear. If something is true, it should be easy to hold in your mind. But that expectation is exactly what prevents deeper insight. Because at foundational levels, reality does not behave in a way that feels intuitive. It does not slow down to match your cognitive limits. It does not restructure itself to reduce your confusion. Here is the hard realization: confusion is not always a problem to solve. Sometimes it is a necessary stage between limited thinking and deeper awareness. But you have been conditioned to treat confusion as failure. So instead of staying with it and letting your understanding expand, you often escape it by returning to familiar but shallow explanations. That habit keeps you comfortable, but also keeps you limited. When you think about existence, you try to force it into clear categories: real or unreal, something or nothing, beginning or absence. But those categories may not be fundamental features of reality. They may simply be tools your mind uses to reduce complexity. And when you apply those tools to something as deep as the structure of existence itself, they start producing distortions. This is where a critical insight emerges. The problem is not that reality is too complicated, but that your mental framework is too rigid. You expect reality to fit into binary outcomes when it may actually operate through gradients, probabilities, and continuous transitions. And that mismatch creates the feeling that something is mysterious, when in fact it is just unfamiliar to your way of thinking. You also underestimate how much your perception filters out. You do not experience raw reality. You experience a processed version of it, shaped by biological limits and cognitive efficiency. That means what feels like obvious truth is often just a simplified model that your mind constructed for survival, not for ultimate understanding. So when you struggle with the idea of the universe emerging from nothing, the struggle may not be about physics alone. It may be about your expectation that every question must resolve into a simple picture. But deeper understanding does not always resolve into simplicity. Sometimes it expands into complexity that cannot be reduced without losing meaning. The shift required here is not to eliminate confusion, but to stop treating it as an enemy. Let it exist without rushing to flatten it into easy answers. Because the moment you stop forcing reality into simple mental boxes, you begin to notice that your previous certainty was not clarity at all. It was limitation disguised as understanding. You keep waiting for reality to finally settle into something you can fully hold in your mind, as if there must be a final explanation that removes all uncertainty. But that expectation is exactly what keeps you stuck at the surface level of understanding. Because the deeper you go into existence, the more you realize that stability is not the default state of reality. It is something your mind constructs to make survival possible. You are used to thinking in fixed outcomes. A question should have an answer. A problem should have a solution. A beginning should lead to an end. But that structure is not necessarily how reality is built. It is how your brain organizes information after the fact. You take a continuous flow of events and compress it into simplified stories so you can function without being overwhelmed. And over time, you start believing those stories are the actual structure of existence. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Your mind prefers closure over accuracy. It would rather accept a simplified answer than remain in a complex, unresolved state. That is why ideas like absolute nothing feel appealing at first. They offer a clean starting point. But that cleanliness is deceptive. It removes the complexity that may actually be essential to understanding what is happening underneath. At deeper levels, what you call reality may not be built from fixed states at all. It may be built from continuous transitions where stability is temporary and change is permanent. That means what you experience as solid and definite is only a narrow slice of a much more fluid system. And once you recognize that, the need for a single definitive origin starts to lose its importance. You also tend to assume that if something cannot be fully visualized, it must be incomplete or unclear. But that assumption is based on the limits of imagination, not the limits of reality. Your ability to picture something is not a measure of its truth. It is only a measure of how well it fits into familiar mental patterns. And when reality exceeds those patterns, it does not become false. It becomes harder to compress into your usual way of thinking. This is where most people unconsciously retreat. When ideas stretch beyond mental comfort, they label them as too abstract and return to simpler interpretations. But that retreat comes at a cost. It preserves comfort while sacrificing depth. It keeps thinking predictable while limiting expansion. The shift required here is subtle but important. Stop using mental comfort as a measure of truth. Just because an idea is difficult to hold in your mind does not mean it is wrong. It may simply mean it is closer to how reality actually behaves, outside the boundaries of simplified thinking. Because once you accept that reality does not owe you simplicity, you stop forcing it into rigid structures. And in that moment, the question of whether everything came from nothing becomes less like a final puzzle to solve and more like a limitation of how that question was framed in the first place. You keep chasing the idea of a final explanation, as if there must be a point where everything clicks into perfect clarity and no further questions remain. But that expectation is built on a misunderstanding of how deep understanding actually works. The deeper you go into reality, the less it behaves like a closed system with final answers, and the more it behaves like an unfolding structure that refuses to settle into one permanent interpretation. At a surface level, it feels reasonable to assume that if you go far enough, you will reach the base layer of existence, a place where everything becomes simple, complete, and fully explained. But that assumption is based on how everyday problems work, not how fundamental reality works. Everyday problems have endpoints. Deep structures often do not. They expand the more closely you examine them, rather than collapsing into simplicity. Here is a difficult truth. Your mind is addicted to finality. It wants conclusions because conclusions feel like control. If something is solved, your mind can rest. But reality does not guarantee that kind of rest. It does not present itself as a neatly packaged system waiting for your final interpretation. Instead, it reveals layers that constantly push your understanding further than you expected to go. You also assume that nothing must be the ultimate foundation because it feels like the simplest possible starting point. But simplicity is not the same as fundamentality. Something can feel simple in your imagination and still be completely disconnected from how reality actually operates. The idea of absolute nothingness is emotionally clean, but conceptually unstable when examined closely. It removes complexity by assumption, not by evidence. As you think more deeply, you begin to notice something uncomfortable. Every time you try to reduce existence to a single origin point, that origin point starts to require its own explanation. If everything came from nothing, then what defines that nothing? If it has properties that allow anything to emerge, is it truly nothing, or is it already something more complex than the word suggests? This is where your simple model begins to break under its own weight. The mistake is not in asking the question. The mistake is in assuming the question has a final, clean resolution that fits inside human categories of understanding. You are trying to force a limitless system into a finite explanation style, and that mismatch creates the endless cycle of partial answers that never fully satisfy you. The shift in thinking here is crucial. Stop expecting a final layer where everything becomes simple and complete. Start recognizing that deeper understanding may not reduce complexity. It may reveal that complexity is permanent, and that what you call answers are just temporary stopping points in an ongoing expansion of insight. Because once you stop demanding closure from reality, you begin to see that the pursuit of a final explanation might itself be the illusion. Not because truth is absent, but because truth was never meant to be a single endpoint you arrive at and finish. You've been looking for an origin point like it's a final answer that will settle everything in your mind. But that search is built on a silent assumption that existence must behave like a story with a clear beginning. Once that assumption is questioned, the entire framing of "did everything come from nothing" starts to lose its authority. Because the real issue is not whether something came from nothing, but whether your mind is even capable of defining nothing in a way that matches reality. At this point, you have to face something uncomfortable. The question itself may be too limited for the system it is trying to describe. You are asking for a clean transition from absence to existence. But that expectation is based on human-style logic, not necessarily the structure of the universe. Reality does not show any obligation to follow the format your thinking prefers. It does not pause to create a clear boundary between before and after, just so your understanding can feel complete. Here is the final harsh realization. Your need for a beginning is emotional as much as it is intellectual. A beginning gives comfort. It creates the illusion that everything is traceable, explainable, and ultimately controllable through understanding. But when you strip that comfort away, you are left with something more unsettling, a reality that may not offer a single origin point at all, only continuous unfolding that does not require a first moment in the way you imagine it. You also need to confront how easily your mind confuses labels with reality. Nothing is just a word, but you treat it as a physical condition. You imagine it as a perfect void, yet every attempt to define it introduces structure, properties, or rules that make it no longer truly nothing. The moment you can describe it, it stops being the absolute absence you originally meant. That contradiction is not a flaw in physics, it is a limitation in language and thought. So the real shift is not finding a better answer. It is recognizing the limits of the question itself. You are trying to compress something vast, dynamic, and possibly non-linear into a simple origin story your mind can comfortably store. But reality does not promise that kind of simplicity, and it never did. Once that is accepted, the entire obsession with a single moment of creation starts to dissolve. What remains is not a neat conclusion, but a deeper awareness that existence may not be built around beginnings and endings the way your thinking expects. And that is the final challenge you are left with. Stop demanding that reality justify itself in a form your mind finds easy. Because the moment you let go of that demand, you are forced to confront something far more direct. That understanding reality is not about reaching a final answer, but about realizing there may never have been a final question to begin with.